Okay. We're speaking about the various levels of intensity of white, which relates to the lesions which a person finds on his body. And the Torah tells us that this evaluation, whether it is considered a leprous lesion or not, is evaluated by the Kohen, and it's only through his pronouncement does he assume that level of contamination. Meaning, even if it may be a lesion which is a lesion which would be considered leprosy, but unless the Kohen pronounces it to be tomei, to be such, the person is not considered contaminated, and he's permitted to remain in the camps. He's permitted to go into the sanctuary. He's permitted to eat consecrated meat. If he's a Kohen, he's permitted to eat truma. The Medrash tells us that the first being to speak Lashon Hara was the ancient snake, the serpent, the Garden of Eden. He had spoken and actually slandered God through speech. Initially, the snake of the Garden of Eden was able to speak. It was considered an intelligent creature. And he had seduced Chava to eat of the tree of knowledge by actually saying something false about God. He said to Chava that the reason why God doesn't want you to eat of the tree of knowledge is because God is a creator. And because he's a creator, he doesn't want anyone to ascend to a level of his ability of being a creator. And God received his creative powers by eating of this tree. And that's why he forbade you to eat of this tree. This is what he said to Chava, and he convinced her. And she was, we'll speak whether she was gullible or there was a basis to believe this. And she ate. So the first one to use the power of speech in a negative context was the Nochosh, was the snake, the ancient snake of the Gan Eden, of the Garden of Eden. What was his punishment? God says, until now you had legs and you stood up on two. Now your legs will be removed from you. You will slither on your belly. Until now, you had the power of speech. You no longer have the power of speech. And not only that, every snake has circles on its skin, which is similar to psoriasis. That is the equivalent of leprosy. That because you misused your speech and spoke negatively about God, therefore, this is the consequence. Dirt shall be your fodder, earth. So what is a consequence of what? Of speaking Lashon Hara, speaking, using the power of speech for something which is negative? There's this breakout. You have this trace of that evil. It manifests itself on the skin. And these are the circles on every snake. So every snake forever is condemned to this state of leprosy. And therefore, what is a snake to humanity? A snake is always something which is like a pariah. People have difficulty, cannot coexist with snakes. And the Torah tells us that you will bite its victim, but the human being will smash your head, will want to kill you because you represent something evil. That's the snake. There's an expression in English. He's a snake in the grass. Meaning there's a certain degree of falseness and slyness and trying to mislead someone through that person's behavior. This goes back to the ancient snake. There's a question which is asked, every species can only exist within its habitat. If it's not within its habitat, it cannot survive because the food that it needs to live has to be available to it. So if it's not within its habitat, it doesn't have its sustenance, it dies. God says to the snake that earth shall be your fodder. That means wherever you are, you're guaranteed survival. So it turns out the curse that Hashem had given to the snake for seducing Chava to eat of the tree of knowledge was a blessing, wasn't a curse. Every other species, for it to survive, has to be its habitat. In terms of the snake, even wherever it may be, every location has earth. And if that's the case, the snake, there's no location on earth where a snake cannot survive. Because there's always some association, availability of earth. It's a question which is asked. So the curse ultimately is the greatest blessing in terms of survival. We'd ask the question, the Torah tells us, if a person notices he has this lesion, which may be leprosy, he summons the Kohen, goes to the Kohen makes an evaluation, and he's not clear. So he quarantines that person for a week. After a week, the Kohen visits that person, makes a reevaluation. If the first week he realizes it's not, the person has to go to the mikveh. He has to take his clothing, immerse them in the mikveh, because he assumes some level of contamination. And then he re-enters as part of Jewish society. Let's say after a week, it can't be determined. He quarantines him for another week. And after the second week, again, reevaluates it. Turns out to be, it's not the leprous lesion. Again, he's contaminated, has to immerse himself in the mikvah, his clothing are contaminated, and he re-enters into society, and he's no longer contaminated. So the question we asked was, if in fact it turns out that it's not a leprous lesion, why is it contaminated? Leprosy contaminates. So if it's the real thing, we understand why there's a basis for contamination. So you say a lesion which is not the real thing, it's a semi-lesion. But here it's been determined this is not the lesion of leprosy. So if it's not the lesion of leprosy, why is he contaminated? It seems to me it's an obvious question. Now, the Gemara tells us that Mitzorah Choshev Kemes, there are a number of people which are classified as if they're non-existent, as if they died. Oni Choshev Kemes, the Gemara tells us. The Torah tells us that initially, Moshe, after he killed the Egyptian, 2 Jews informed on him, and Moshe had to flee from Egypt, and he only returned when he was 80 years old. Who are the 2 Jews who informed on him? Dosan Aviram. Fast forward, he's at the burning bush. Hashem says to Moshe, it's time to return, because the people who initially informed on you are no longer alive. Mesu Anoshim, the people who formed, they died. So the Gemara asks a question, what do you mean they died? Dosan Aviram, they were part of the mutiny of Korach to usurp Moshe's authority. And their lives came to an end when they were swallowed up by the earth. So what do you mean they died? We see they're alive. So the Gemara answers that initially Dosan Aviram were wealthy Jews, even within the slave class, they were wealthy Jews. And because they had such wealth, that certain relationships within the Egyptian government and the higher echelons, and therefore they were able to inform Moshe Rabbeinu what he did. However, because they became impoverished, they no longer had that level of relationship. So now you could go back. You were able to go back because they died. So from here, what do you mean they died? But they're fully alive. So the Moret says, we see from here, Odi Choshev Kemes, that when a person becomes impoverished, because his value has been devalued within society. People don't value any longer, and he becomes a ward of other people. It's the equivalent you're no longer alive. That's the takeaway from what Hashem had said to Moshe Rabbeinu. They are no longer alive. Okay? The Gemara tells us, Iver Choshev Kemes. God forbid a person loses his eyesight, he's like no longer alive. Why? Because if a person is not able, we say that seeing is reality. When you see, you're able to take in much and you're able to internalize what you see. God forbid a person loses his sight, you no longer see it. Basically, the essence of life, the benefits, the pleasure of life comes to an end. Therefore, even Choshev Kemes, person God forbid is blind, is considered like a good part of his life has come to an end. The Gemara tells us in one location, the Torah tells us that the Jews ate the man for 40 years. Any level of food, which a person wanted it to take on that level of taste, nourishment, it took on that level. You wanted it should be equivalent of fish. It took on the qualities of fish, taste-wise, nourishment-wise, and the person was sustained as if he ate fish, or whatever it may be. There's an argument that Gemara in Yuma, although it may have nourished you as that, the question is, did it have the texture of the food, of that type of food? Let's say it was a type of food which was crunchy. Did it take on that crunchy taste that you're able to have the full benefit as if you're eating the food? The only thing that was lacking was it looked like a wafer. But when you put this wafer in your mouth, whatever you had in mind, it should assume that level of taste, it took on that taste. So the Gemara asks a question we read in the Torah, when Moshe Rabbeinu speaks about the man, that we ate it, we consumed it for 40 years, it says, Vayamcha ve'erivecha. When you ate the man, you were afflicted and you were denied. So Gemara asks, why are you denied? If the man took on the taste, even the texture, and the nourishment, why, by eating the man, why was that considered being an affliction? You were denied. Why are you denied? That's the worst question. And not only that, it had the ultimate benefit that it was absorbed in their inner organs. They didn't have to do their bodily functions. So the inconvenience of going out of the camp to do your bodily functions wasn't necessary. So our answer is that when you eat food, the visual of the food, seeing the food in the context of what it is a significant part of pleasure of eating. That's what the Gemara says. And since they didn't see the food in the context of what it assumed, so the main part benefit of food is lacking. Therefore, it's considered an affliction. So the Gemara says, Rav Yosef, who's one of the leading Amoraim interpreters of Mishnah, said he became blind later in life. He said it's true because I can never, whatever I eat, I can never be satisfied because I'm not able to see the food. And the Gemara says, therefore, on Shabbos, that there's a mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos. When you eat your meal, it should be in a location that's illuminated. Why? Because since the visual is a key component of pleasure, of benefiting from the food, enjoying it, therefore, it should be well lit, the location you eat your Shabbos food, to be able to see it. So therefore, ani choshev kemes. So ani, a iver, a person who's blind, who's not able to see the world, see what color, whatever it may be, a major part of life is denied to him, is cut off from him. We find that Yitzchak Avinu, when he became blind, and that's how the whole story became, how Yaakov was able to take the birthright, it says that although Hashem doesn't associate his name with a person as long as he's alive, to say Elokei Avram, Elokei Yaakov, but Yitzchak, even when he was still alive, Hashem associated his name with Yitzchak. He referred to himself as Elokei Yitzchak when he spoke to Yaakov. So Rashi immediately cites the Chazal, the Midrash. But if God doesn't identify with a person until he's no longer alive, because he still has choice, and Chas v'sholom, he's able to choose, regardless of where he is, to become defiant. So why did Hashem associate his name with Yitzchak, although Yitzchak was still alive? So the Midrash tells us, because since Yitzchak is blind, and the main temptation is determined because we're able to see, we're drawn towards what we see. And since Yitzchak himself was blind and he was cut off from the world, therefore he no longer had the evil inclination. And therefore, God, the whole issue of reverting back to a position of defiance or denial of God's presence has no relevance to the Yitzchak. Therefore, God associates his name with Lokei Yitzchak. The third person who's considered Kemes is Mitzorah. Mitzorah Choshev Kemes. A leper is like a dead man. Now, why is a leper? Torah says he has a lesion, he has a tag, which has a certain degree of intensity of white. And if it's evaluated that it meets the characteristics of leprosy, he must go out of the camps, out of all the camps. He's not permitted to be associated with any other Jew. He has to be in solitude during this period of time. We explained, according to all the commentators, that the leprosy which the Torah speaks about is not the leprosy that we know of. This degenerative disease. It's not that. It's not a contractible disease. It's not. It's just purely a tag which indicates that the person crossed the line too many times and he had spoken and he abused the power of speech. So if that's the case, why is he choshev kemes? Why is he considered like a dead man? The others who he explained, he has no value because he's impoverished. He becomes a ward of others. Blind, he can't relate to the world. But a Mitzorah, why is it considered kemes? So seemingly, we see something interesting. A Jew, we find that, and I mentioned this many times, that whenever the Torah speaks about kores, what is kores? Spiritual excision, you cut off from God. Whenever the Torah speaks, so if you cut off from God, how should the Torah speak about if a Jew eats on Yom Kippur? Deliberately, the liability is kores. You cut off, it should say, "V'nichras ha'nefeshi me Hashem." You cut off from God, it doesn't say that. "V'nichras ha'nefeshi me ameho." You cut off from your people. "V'nichras ha'nefeshi me Yisrael." You cut off from the Jewish people. So we explained, because God only has a relationship with people if you're part of the Jewish people. If you're part of the whole, you have a relationship with God. Hashem doesn't have a relationship with individuals. So a person who's cut off from the Jewish people because he ate on Yom Kippur, or he violated certain ancestral relationships, or whatever it may be, you're considered not part of the Jewish people. You're outside. That's like you're excommunicated. So if you're no longer attached to the core, automatically you have no relationship with God. What is the basis for a Jew? What's life dependent upon? It says, when you cleave to God, that's called life. Hashem is the source of life. This is what I'm saying. That was the Maral of Prague. When a Jew is attached to God, he's vibrant, he's fully functional. The moment you sever that connection, you're ending the life of that person. Because the life of a Jew is not his physicality, it's his spirituality. If the Torah says a person who has this lesion, which is questionable, and he has to be quarantined, and no Jew could be associated with him during that week of being quarantined, or 2 weeks, what happens when he comes out of that quarantine? Although it was determined what he has was not a leprous lesion. Nevertheless, but since during that period of time, he was cut off from the Jewish people, so the connection to life, which is his spirituality, he was severed. The consequence of that is contamination. It's not the contamination of a full-blown leper, which is a whole process, how he's reinstated, how he's rehabilitated, but factually being all by himself, cut off, being this pariah, even for a short period of time, it causes this contamination. What's contamination? Contamination is a result of being cut off from the source of life. So because he was cut off from the source of life, as a result of that, therefore, it causes this contamination. So when he comes back and it's determined it's not a leprous lesion, he has to immerse himself in the mikvah, and his clothing that he was wearing, those clothing also assume a contaminated status. The Mishnah in Sota tells us, and the Gemara elaborates on this, that God always deals with the person measure for measure. The Mishnah tells us that who buried Yaakov Avinu? Who was the one who oversaw to make sure Yaakov was buried in the Marsa Machpelah, taken out of Egypt? Yosef. So the greatest human being in the world, because he was the viceroy of Egypt, besides being the most special son of Yaakov, attended to the burial needs of his father. So because Yosef, being the greatest, attended to his burial needs of his father, the greatest Jew who ever lived in existence attended to the burial needs of Yosef. Who took the remains of Yosef out of Egypt? Moshe Rabbeinu. Nobody was greater than Moshe. So that's measure for measure. That because Yosef, the greatest person, assumed responsibility for the burial of his father, therefore the greatest person who ever lived assumed responsibility for the burial of what? Of Yosef, by taking his remains out of Egypt. This is the Mishnah. And because Moshe, the greatest human being ever lived, assumed responsibility for Yosef, so if that's the case, how do you have measure for measure? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, God himself, attended to the burial needs of Moshe Rabbeinu. As the Torah says at the end, who buried Moshe Rabbeinu? Hashem buried Moshe Rabbeinu. That's meter connected meter. That's measure for measure. So the Mishnah continues. We find that when Moshe was 3 months old, his mother put him into the Nile. And the Torah tells us, "Vatesatza v'achosi mirocho." His sister stood from a distance. Liros ma'yefso. What's going to happen? Is he going to drown? Not going to drown. And because she stood and waited to see what was going to happen, the reward for that was when she became a leper in the desert for a week, for her to recover. The Shekhinah waited for her. The clouds of glory waited for her. The 600,000 Jews above the age of 20 waited for her until she recovered. And only after she was reinstated did they continue to travel. So the question they asked is, do me a favor. Just keep going. I have enough embarrassment. I did the wrong thing. Here, there's nobody. People say, why all of a sudden are we way late for a week? You know why? Because Miriam spoke Lashon about her brother. She became a leper. And as a result of that, we're held up for a week. What level of embarrassment does? This is measure for measure reward. As you waited for your brother, which is, although it was only a moment, the Shekhinah, the clouds of glory, the Jewish people, they're waiting for you. Do me a favor, just keep going. I'll catch up. That's considered reward, right? The question is asked, right? So it's your question plus a little bit. Now, when you say that verse, that posuk, Zoches asher osa Hashem Elokecha leMiriam, b'tzeischu Mitzrayim. Remember what Hashem did to Miriam when you went out of Egypt. When you say that posuk, if filling a mitzvah say it's a positive commandment. It's one of the 240 positive commandments. As a result of Jews understanding the ramifications of speaking irresponsibly, although the Midrash tells us and the Ramban elaborates on this, she loved her brother. It was a criticism, but she didn't mean really malice or anything. But nevertheless, since it was something which is inappropriate, as great as you may be, if it's not acceptable, there's a consequence. And that's why she became a leper. So from that time going forward, every Jew who actually does not speak, does not abuse the power of speech, who does that benefit accrue to? That accrues to Miriam. Because the lesson that's being learned so well is only due to Miriam, that because it became public knowledge that she was a leper because of that. That's the reward. That's the measure for measure. She waited a moment. We're going to wait for you. And you know what the value of waiting for a moment? That means Jews till the end of time, if they actually are careful and say things only what they should say, who's the one who's the beneficiary? Miriam Hanaviyah. Miriam the prophetess. Okay, that's the way it's explained. So let's get back to the snake. We asked the question, God says that because you slandered me and you seduced to Chava to eat of the tree of knowledge, earth will be a fair. So the question is, it seems to be not a curse. Every other species, it has to survive, it has to be in its habitat. But if it's not in its habitat, it can't survive. The snake, wherever it is, because there's earth all over, so the snake can only survive wherever the snake may be. We're explaining now what is the basis for the contamination of the Jew, although when he's in quarantine. Because if you're not part of the Jewish people, God has a relation with the Jewish people. Since when you're quarantined, you're cut off from the Jewish people, being cut off from the source of life, that causes this contamination. Okay, now, the Gemara tells us in Avodah Zorah that it speaks about God's daily schedule. What does the God do all day? What does he do? So the Gemara says in Avodah Zorah, the first 3 hours of the day, Hashem studies Torah. The second 3 hours of the day, he judges the world. The third 3 hours of the day, he determines the sustenance for the world from this largest creature to the smallest creature. How much sustenance does it need? And this is something Hashem addresses every day. Mikarni Reim al Beit Zikinim. From the greatest creature, the Reim, which was the greatest creature, to the smallest, to almost that's at a microscopic level. Whatever sustenance they need, Hashem every day focuses on and determines how much sustenance they should receive. The 3 hours, he studies Torah with the neshamos of the children who passed away when they were young, before they were bar mitzvah. He studies Torah with those neshamos. That's what he does during the fourth 3 hours of the day. Okay? So every day, Hashem is involved with every species to determine how much sustenance it needs. You know what that means? That means every species in existence God has in mind to make sure it has sufficient sustenance. The snake is so despised by God because it took creation down, but through seducing Chava to eat of the tree of knowledge, Hashem says, I didn't want to think about you. Wherever you are, you have your sustenance because you don't have to be in your habitat. That is the greatest curse. The greatest curse is to be cut off from God. That God doesn't even have to think about you. Every species, from the greatest to the smallest, Hashem thinks about every species every day. How much sustenance does it need? The snake is such a despised creature because of what it did. Hashem says, I don't want to think about you. That's the degree that he despises the snake. Therefore, what you think is the blessing, that's the curse. You may have all the food available, but being disconnected from God because God doesn't even want to think about you, that is the ultimate curse. So it's similar here. If you're part of the Jewish people, you have relevance to Kedusha. Because the life of a Jew is not his physicality. It's his relation with God. And if you're part of the Jewish people, then you're thriving and you're pulsating. Once you cut off, because when you're in quarantine, no Jew is allowed to be associated with you. Therefore, you cut off from the source of life. Therefore, that causes that vacuum, that void. And the result of that is spiritual contamination. No. God, Ernie.
Why is a saras, a leper, considered kames, like a dead person, if they're just physically disconnected from the Jewish people, not spiritually disconnected?
That's what we explained. A person goes on a vacation and he wants to go meditate out in a desert. Halachically, you're not disconnected. Wherever you are, you're part of the Jewish people. Here, because of what you did, because over you have this leprous lesion, is an indication that you're bordering on that level of total disconnection, which is the full-blown leper. It was determined not, but halachically, legally, during this period, you're not permitted to be part of the Jewish people. You're not permitted. What is kores? Kores is a reality. You're detached from the Jewish people because of your misbehavior. That's what kores is. You ate on Yom Kippur. Because of that, it creates a detachment, and the detachment doesn't allow you to have the full relationship with God because you're not attached as you should be attached to the Jewish people. It's a semi-detachment. Being in the quarantine state here, it's not in quarantine because we're concerned people are going to contract a disease from you. No, because of there was a degree of misbehavior during this period of time, you quarantined, and no Jew could be associated with you. It's a legal law. It's a legal state. So it's like a semi-kores situation, except it lasts for a week. and it's based on the valuation of the Kohen. After a week, if he determines that it's not a leprous lesion, you're able to come back. So you're reconnected. But since there was a time you were semi-connected, during this time, that creates that impurity, and therefore he's required to go to the mikveh when he comes out of the quarantine.
By any